Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are here tonight as a community of readers to celebrate the culmination of the Runner Reader program here on campus and the One Book, One Bakersfield, One Kern in the greater Bakersfield and Kern County communities. Before we begin, we always want to start to make sure that this evening is memorable for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons. Everybody take out your cell phone, check it out, make sure that it's on silence or just turn the thing off. Thank you very much. So, again, welcome to an evening with Boz Dreisinger. This is the 12th year for CSUB to hold this culminating event, which is held in support of both the Runner Reader program here on campus and the Kern County Library's One Book, One Bakersfield, One Kern Community Read program. This year, in addition to the students here at CSUB, who are the students who are reading the book in their first year experience courses, their composition courses, and the gen ed classes, we're also joined by Kern High School art and English students. Any Kern High School students here tonight? Come on, clap for yourself. Students at Taft College, got any Taft College students? There they are over there. And Bakersfield College, any BC students? Right in the middle. Oh, okay, don't show off. All right. We got any members from the community at large? All right, excellent. This year, I want you all to know, you didn't know this, but this year we also went worldwide. So we had students here at CSUB's American Language Institute. Those are foreign students who are studying English so they can go on to college in the United States. They're reading the book, as well as a pilot study with some students at Connect University in Yangon, Myanmar, and some students in Nysa, Poland. So you've been reading a book not just with people here in Bakersfield and Kern County, but people all around the world. And of course, we've also been partnering with the Kern County Library through the One Book, One Bakersfield, One Kern Community Read since 2010, and Incarceration Nations is also the selection for the entire community this year. And I think that the people at the Kern County Library really did an amazing job of putting a huge program together. Let's give them a big round of applause, please. So I think it's pretty cool. If you've read this book, that means you're connected to people not just here on campus or your own campuses, but people all over the world through a shared academic and social experience. And I think that's pretty fantastic. So as we near the end of this year's Runner Reader and One Book Read, we are fortunate tonight to have the author herself, Dr. Boz. She's with us tonight to talk about her book and her experiences writing it. So after her speech, you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. There are microphones 1, 2, and 3. After all of the questions are answered, she will be available to sign copies of your book. When that time happens, I'll let you know, but I want you also to know that we really should be very appreciative. We have our own local bookstore named Russo's, and they're out in the lobby, as they have been every year since we started this thing, selling books. Let's give Russo's a big hand. So it's exciting, I know, to get your book signed, but I ask everybody to please remain in your seats until all of the questions are answered, because you don't know where the line's going to start, and I'm not going to tell you until the time comes. So it's my pleasure right now to introduce tonight's speaker, and the reason you're all here tonight. Tonight we're pleased to welcome Dr. Boz Dreisinger, who is a professor of English at City University of New York's John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She earned her PhD in English from Columbia University, specializing in American and African American studies. At John Jay, she is the founding academic director of the Prison to College Pipeline program, which offers college courses and re-entry planning to incarcerated men at Otisville Correctional Facility, and broadly works to increase access to higher education for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. In addition, she's an author, a journalist, a critic, a documentary film producer, and a noted speaker. She was named a 2017-2018 Global Fulbright Scholar, and she's been working around the world to replicate the Prison to College pipeline with a focus on the Caribbean and South Africa. She doesn't like to spend winters in New York, so she gets to go to South Africa. Figure. She is currently working on a roadmap for how prison to college pipelines and restorative justice can replace mass incarceration as a system of justice. Let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Boz.
Do I have X? Got it. Hello, good evening. Hi, Bakersfield. You guys are a beautiful audience, and I'm so happy, honored, privileged to be here today. So thank you to all who have coordinated tonight. And we're going to have I hate to say a good time because we're talking about global mass incarceration, but we are going to have a really rich evening together. And I am privileged to be able to share it with you, truly, and to have met some of you earlier today. It's especially exciting to be talking to a room of people who have mostly read my book. That's a rare occurrence. Usually I'm speaking to audiences, maybe some people have read it, but most people are not familiar with the book, not so familiar even with the topic of mass incarceration. And so because I get to stand here with a group of people who've read my book, I get to do something different. So what I'm gonna do with you tonight, if it's okay with you, is share a little bit of behind the scenes about the book, share a little bit about the sort of the past of writing the book, but also the future of writing the book, and the work that has come out of it and the projects that I'm embarking on now, and share with you a lot of things that actually I've never shared with anyone with relation to both the book and with relation to the work that I'm doing now. So that's what makes tonight especially exciting for me, and I hope that you'll appreciate that and join in this journey with me. I'm going to share stuff about myself and the process of the book writing, but I'm also going to share some stories about individuals who've been impacted by the book and the results of that impact. And I want, as I kind of run through, and I know I'm talking to the Instagram generation predominantly, so I came armed with photographs and imagery. And I want you to think about 3 words as I talk, because these are sort of, I call them the 3 Ps. They guide my life, they guide my work, and I think they're tremendously important. So I'm going to ask you to repeat after me. The first one is passion. The second is purpose. And the third is persistence. Persistence is actually a nice way of saying obsession and zealotry, because I'm about those things too. When you're committed to something, you should be committed on that level. But persistence is a nicer way of saying those things. So the first thing that I think you should know about Incarceration Nations is that initially no one wanted it, and no one wanted me to write it. I had the notion of doing a book about prisons. It was back in 2010, 2011, and I had a very high-profile, fancy literary agent who's a wonderful man at that time, and I came to him with this very vague notion of I want to write a book about prisons, and I want it to be global, and I don't really know what that means, but that's what I want to do. And he looked at me as if I were insane, and he said, "You're not doing a book about prisons." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Nobody wants to read about prisons. It's too grim. It's too miserable. No one wants to read about prisons. And especially, this is America. No one cares about the world. They want to read, if you're going to have to write about something like this, it has to be about America." And he said, "I'll represent you on any project as long as it's not this one." So, and this is a very, again, high-profile, powerful literary agent. So I said, okay, I guess I have to find a new agent. So I went hunting for a new agent, and I thought this can't be that difficult. I mean, I'm a professional writer with a pretty good track record. I'm sure I can find another writer who'll believe in this project. And one after the next, I heard those words again and again. Nobody wants to read about prisons. And I was about to give up, but again, remember the 3 Ps, right? Passion, persistence, purpose. And in my head, I just knew that this book had to be done. And finally, I started scouring my email inbox, and I found an old email. This was around the time that Orange is the New Black came out and was a big hit. Any fans in here? So I'm a fan. I'm actually a fan of the book more so than the show. But and Piper is a dear friend of mine, an amazing woman. But she wrote me this email, and she said, "Oh, Orange is the New Black is a big hit. Maybe you're onto something with this prison stuff." So we met, and she was a young early 20s, scrappy young agent from a very small agency that was a joke of an agency, really, in many respects, compared to the big prestigious one. And she ended up taking on the project. So I had found mistakes and made poor choices and done some awful things. And so the work that I've undertaken as part of the Prison to College Pipeline program, and I'm going to break down for you the various components, involve a whole host of measures, all aimed, again, at this idea of connecting and correcting. And I should say, too, I've been told I was crazy quite a number of times in my life, usually by people in positions of authority. The first time was when I proposed launching the Prison to College Pipeline, and as I wrote about in the book, I started working in prisons 15 years ago. It was nowhere near on the public radar the way it is now. And the first time often when I would tell people I teach in prisons, they would look at me as if I were insane and then say, why are you educating those criminals, and so on and so forth. Well, people stopped saying that to me now because things have changed in the US. This is a popular topic. It attracted enough of you in the room to come chat with me tonight. But that wasn't the case 15 years ago. I heard, again, when I was trying to write Incarceration Nations, a lot of, that's crazy. Why do you want to write a book about prisons? No one wants to read about prisons. Then when I started launching the Incarceration Nations network, what I heard was, you can't do this work globally. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. How do you deal with the world's prison crisis? We have enough of a crisis on our own hands here in America with 2.3 million people incarcerated. So you can't take this on globally. And as I usually do, I ignored them. And again, passion, persistence, and purpose, and went on with my business. And so the more I do it, the more it actually, number one, the more the world feels remarkably small, the more it becomes obvious that the crisis of incarceration looks frighteningly similar, whether you're talking about Taiwan, Thailand, Tanzania, or Texas. And that, in fact, there is a strategy to starting to undo this mess in a global context. And so, of course, the first piece of it is the Prison to College Pipeline and thinking about my favorite hashtag, which is education, not incarceration. And so what I began doing was collaborating with various institutions to, I don't say replicate the Prison to College Pipeline, but to build together with organizations on the ground versions of the Prison to College Pipeline in various countries. And the first country to launch it was the UK. Actually inside this prison that I'm standing outside. It's Pentonville Prison. I was there 2 weeks ago, and it's one of the worst prisons in Britain. It's overcrowded. I was rattled within moments from walking in there, just from the sound alone. It's one of the oldest prisons in the world, also modeled after Eastern. And I'm proud to say that there is a program there that is very, very similar to the Prison to College Pipeline, with students from the outside going in and students, when they're home, continuing on with their education upon release. The other countries that I've been working in to launch versions and to collaborate with institutions to build versions of Prison to College Pipeline in are Jamaica, Trinidad, South Africa, Brazil, and now, as of last week, Ghana. I'll get to Ghana shortly, but it was a country where I had no intention of going in the context of Prison to College Pipeline, and yet it seemed to happen anyway. Because the incredible thing is that, and we're in the state of California, which has taken tremendous strides in terms of education inside prisons, just in the past few years alone. In the rest of the world, when you tell people college and prison, when you even put those two words in the same sentence, once again, you get the crazy look. No one in prison can go to college. That's unheard of. And yet, and I've been told that again and again, and yet every time I set foot in a prison in that country, I encounter multiple people who belong in university, who belong in college, who are well capable of it. Of these, I think 2 of them, I'll share briefly the stories because I think they're pretty amazing. One is Brazil. This is actually a prison in Brazil. It's in Rio. It's called Bangu, and it has 28,000 people in it. Like, wrap your brain around that for a moment. 28,000 people. That's a village. It's not even a correctional facility. And I went in there because I run a study abroad program in South Africa, and I take my students to prison. We go to Pollsmoor, and we go to one other prison, and it's a big part of the experience. And the day we went to one particular prison, which was the first one we visited, we were all very emotional. It was a moving day. Everyone was crying. But I had one student named Renata, who was Brazilian, and she was sobbing. For hours on end, she could not stop sobbing the entire time. And on the way out of the prison, she took my arm and she said, "Boz, every male in my family in Brazil has been to prison. My uncle was murdered in a Brazilian prison. I've never dealt with it until this day." So I looked at her and I said, "Well, let's go to Brazil and figure out how to do something." She said, "I want to build prison to college pipeline Brazil." I said, "Perfect." And we did. We organized for her and I to go. I got her scholarship money. The university supported it. And we went to Rio. And we went into prisons in Sao Paulo and Rio and this one. And that's her looking like a whirlwind of action because she sprung to life the minute she got in there. And the first person she met, this was inside the women's facility where they took us first. The first person she met was a young woman from her exact favela, her exact community in the poor area of Rio where she's from, with her same name, Renata. And from then on, the tears came and the tears came. And Renata was just back in Brazil. We haven't launched yet. We're working with both universities in both Sao Paulo and Brazil, but she was just back there a couple of weeks ago, putting the next steps into place, figuring out how this is going to look, meeting with funders, and she went back without me to coordinate all of this by herself, who is a student. She's just a year out of college, so not too far from your own age, doing amazing things. The other prison to college pipeline launch that's especially dear to my heart is South Africa. In South Africa, I have been obsessed with launching a prison to college pipeline since Pollsmoor. As I said, I've never shaken that place from my world, from my spirit. And I've been building relationships until the point where when I was there earlier this year, I said, one way or another, we have a partner university now, we're launching. And we're launching on Mandela Day, his 100th birthday, in July. And my partner looked at me, he gave me the crazy look again, and he said, we can't launch in July, we don't have this in place, we don't have that in place. I said, we're launching in July. It's going to be the highest profile event in any prison in South African history. We're going to film all of it with a professional film crew, and period, end of story. Sure enough, it happened. This was our invitation. We had an event. We filmed it with an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. We're working on the short film that came out of that. Devon Simmons, who is the first graduate of the Prison to College Pipeline in New York, my student, was the keynote speaker. We flew him out to speak. We had commentary. I had asked colleagues of mine from all over the world to have their students write in response to the famous Mandela quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." I asked students in Malawi prison, in Ghanaian prison, in Thai prisons, in British prisons. All of my colleagues, or comrades as I like to call them, sent me writing by their students. This was all read at the launch. And when I sat in the prison with the South African Prison to College Pipeline students and they saw those writings from Brazil, from Ghana, from Britain, from all over the world, they said, this is exactly me. I relate to this. I know what this person is living. I'm living the same thing even though I'm many miles away in a totally different context. It was one of those affirming moments where I saw that it is possible to do this work globally and to speak of the crisis in a global context because the connections run so incredibly deep. So I was mentioning earlier that in so many respects, the US is the only place where mass incarceration is even remotely a mainstream topic. Almost everywhere else in the world, there is no conversation about this. I have never been to a country where corrections didn't fall either at the bottom of the budget or the second to bottom of the government budget. No one wants to deal with this. The old, no one wants to talk about prisons is true in so many places in the world. How do we change that? I feel like I witnessed that shift in the US, and to some small degree was part of that shift as I was involved in the movement. How do we bring about that shift in the rest of the world? Well, one of the ways is pop culture. Lots of celebrities in the US are involved in the fight against mass incarceration. Where are they globally? Where are the high-profile events where the Alicia Keys of Nigeria is coming to support the End Mass Incarceration movement? So one of the things that I started doing and that INN, the Incarceration Nations Network, does is produce these kinds of events that are not just about let's go to a little academic corner of the world and talk about prisons. No, let's do this in a mainstream context with high-profile people and put this at the center of the conversation and get mainstream media involved. And so one of these events was in the Cayman Islands. Incidentally, my best friend is an actor. That's him. His name is Malik Yoba. He was in New York Undercover back in the day. Most of you are too young to remember that. But he's in a bunch of movies. And, sorry for you if you're my friend. You're going to get roped into the work one way or another. And so Malik came with me on what he thought was a vacation to the Cayman Islands, when in fact we did a massive event that attracted a lot of media attention and attracted a lot of government attention and led to the potential birth of Prison to College Pipeline Cayman Islands. Another event that did similar work was in Trinidad. I did a live stream reading with all of the top musicians on the island of Trinidad who were in there, one movie star. It was live streamed on Facebook, the first ever outside of the US. We did the first one in the US in Philadelphia. So running events that combine sort of pop culture with the issues and get this conversation in the mainstream and not in these cobwebbed corners where no one's talking about it and no one's thinking about it. Hong Kong. I was on the way actually to Australia to do a talk and broke up the trip by going to Hong Kong. Now, I've often found that even when I don't mean to go to prison, I end up in prison. And so I went to Hong Kong thinking, I'm just going to chill for 2 days and eat yummy food and not do anything. Well, turns out that there was someone who'd read my book in Hong Kong and who was really passionate about issues of incarceration. She found out I was there, she sought me out, and arranged a prison visit for me without my planning to do any of this. I went to prison. I went to the women's prison in Hong Kong. I had some conversations with government that never quite went anywhere. But what did happen was I ended up in the newspaper where they did this story about me. And I thought it was a cool story because, again, Hong Kong actually has the highest per capita incarceration rate for women in the world. And yet, there hadn't been, I Googled this to check, there hadn't really been a story about prison that large in the Hong Kong newspaper in years. So I was glad, again, for this to be getting out there, getting out in the news. And one other thing that came out of that was I got a letter from Macau. Now, if you don't know where Macau is, don't feel bad, lots of people don't. It's an island near Hong Kong that was colonized by the Portuguese. It's now independent. Very cool mix of China and Portugal. And I got a letter from this person in Macau who saw the article about me in the Hong Kong newspaper and said, how can I join the Prison to College Pipeline from Macau? Now, that was a pretty incredible letter to me. I get a lot of letters. And so I wrote back, and we started a correspondence. And ultimately, I ended up helping him get enrolled at the University of London in a correspondence course. So he's now studying at the University of London, all because somebody who read my book found me, sent me to prison, landed me in the paper, landed that paper in the prison in Macau. So these are the incredible routes. I've got a couple more stories for you, and then I want to definitely take your comments and questions. So staying in Asia for a minute, I think this is my favorite story of them all, actually. And I share this with you, I think, in part, I'm talking about the 3 Ps, but I'm also trying to highlight how individual acts can make such a massive difference, even if you're not, quote unquote, important, even if you're not famous. Caring, being passionate, and being willing to try to do something goes a long way. So from the left, the second woman from the left is a woman, her name is Alice. Alice read my book in Taiwan when it came out and wrote to me. She sent me an email saying, I loved your book. It changed a lot of things about how I think, and I would love to meet you one day. So I wrote back, well, I'd love to come to Taiwan. Why don't you organize it? So Alice is in her early 20s. She's a law student, an undergraduate student, again, just like many of you. Alice put together that visit. She organized a week-long trip for me to not only come to campus, give talks, but to go to about 4 prisons with her and her friends in a country that never would have given her access had she not been accompanied by the professor from abroad. And it was one of the most incredible trips of my life, because in that time, I never met a single professor, but I met hundreds of students and hundreds of young minds who were passionate and wanting to change the world and wanted to learn and talk and engage. So all that was wonderful. Alice and I kept in touch, and a few months ago, she writes back to tell me, Boz, I have great news. I'm valedictorian. Now, in Taiwan, and she's at National Taiwan University, which is the most prestigious university in Taiwan and one of the most prestigious in Asia, the valedictorian is like, Taylor Swift. I mean, you're a rock star if you're the valedictorian. They televise your speech. The whole country knows your name. It's a very big deal. She says, I'm valedictorian, and I wrote my speech, and it's about our time together, and it's about mass incarceration in Taiwan. She said, it's because I've never been able to get out of my mind what we saw in those prisons. I had no idea that was happening in my own country. As I mentioned earlier, in Taiwan, 80% of these women are in for drug offenses. There's no real rehabilitation. They're all working in kind of factory line, assembly line, producing brownies and cookies. And she was just shocked and appalled. So she gave her speech, and it gets better. She gave her speech, it was televised. The next day, the news shows up at her house. She's all over the Taiwanese news. I have this really cool screenshot of a photo of me with a bunch of headlines I can't read, where she did a whole interview about our meeting and our interaction. And actually, I just spoke to her because I've now hired her to do some work for me. She graduated, she's brilliant, and she's filming some interviews for me. She's doing some groundwork all around Asia for me, and I expect her to absolutely change the world in incredible ways. So, quickly to run through the last few projects, because I can talk all night. There's stories. The stories are endless, and the work is endless. One of the other major projects of the Incarceration Nations Network is an art installation project made up of all the writing by people in prison that I've collected from all around the world for years. And it's called The Writing on the Wall. It's actually based on a biblical story. Obviously, the writing on the wall is a phrase. Can you read the writing on the wall? But some of you may not know that there's a biblical story behind it where the prophet Daniel was asked to read some strange writing that showed up on the wall. And in fact, the meaning of that writing was that there is gloom and doom ahead if you don't get this corrupt system together. And so that's where I took the name from. The Writing on the Wall is going to be, right now it's been a pop-up installation where we wallpaper spaces by writing done by people in prison around the world, but it's going to be a pop-up booth. I want to see it in Bakersfield, so follow up with me. It's going to travel around the US, it's going to travel around the world in spaces where it will take people by surprise and they will be forced to confront that the people in prison are people who write, who think, who feel, who are just like you and me. So again, this process of humanizing. Along the same lines, INN will have a book imprint, and this is the call out for the first volume that we're publishing. It's going to be the first ever collected work of poetry by incarcerated writers around the world. So I've done a global call out. I just got some poems in Greek. They're literally Greek to me. I had to make that stupid joke. But it's going to be a collection of beautiful poetry from the US, from all of these countries, put out by Akashic Press. In about a year from now, we're going to do a nice launch and have opportunity to compensate those incarcerated poets, whether it's to them or to their families, but most powerfully get their voices out there. The last two projects that I'm working on, it's just a little bit of a busy year for me, as you can see. I'm building what I'm calling a platform for innovative prison reform efforts. And this is what I'm really focused on in the past few months and going forward, because for years, it feels like a tremendous privilege. Writing Incarceration Nations, other than Norway, I essentially went from one hell to the next. And it drained me emotionally. It was a hugely rewarding journey, but it was also, it's hard to find the words to describe what it is to see that in person, the level of horror and atrocity and pain and suffering. And so what I want to do now, I've become obsessively solution-focused. Where are the innovations? Who is doing what? How do we showcase that to the world? How do we showcase it to other people, organizations who can replicate it? What should justice look like, and how do we undo this mess? I know that I don't have all the answers, but if we put our collective global heads together, we can create answers. And so what I'm building is going to launch in a year. It's going to be a multimedia website with video interviews, with data, with usable, very user-friendly descriptions of all kinds of innovative efforts that are being made to reduce incarceration levels all over the world, and are capable of being replicated in other countries, and capable of educating the public about what justice looks like when it's not prison, or when it's anti-prison. And so I've visited already a number of countries. I was in Ghana, London, and Belfast last week. On Thursday, I head to Prague and Helsinki. And in all of these places, the feeling of the journey is quite different because I'm looking at solutions, hope, possibility. And so this is just one example. This is at the University of Milan, where this student, he's a student and he is incarcerated. He has a 15-year sentence, and he's doing his degree in philosophy at the University of Milan. He's permitted to leave prison every day, study, be a normal human being, wear normal human being clothes, and then go back to prison. It's an incredible system that I think is replicable in many places. This is the prison in Ghana, where I was just last week with my incredible, who I now consider brothers in Ghana, who have managed to reduce the pretrial population. It used to be 33%. It's down to 13. They've set up mobile courts that are traveling all over the country and dealing with cases in the prison. Not rocket science, which is an amazing thing about justice work. A lot of what needs to be done is not rocket science. It's not genius. It's actually just effort and investment, caring enough, having the passion to do it. And they've set up this program, it's called the Justice for All program, that I see as replicable in countries all over the world who can reduce, there are over 3 million people awaiting trial in these kinds of conditions that you read about in my book. And yet they're still behind bars. often for reasons of ineptitude and poverty. If you get a government to care, if you get a government to put in effort and create more programs like this, you can make a dent in that. You can reduce that population and make a tremendous difference. How do you get the government to care? Well, the government is not going to care if the people don't care. If it's not a popular issue, the governments can then relegate it to the bottom of the barrel. If the people care, if it's out in the public domain, if there are celebrities tweeting about it and others talking about it and demanding that this change, that this is not okay, then things change from that place. So the last project that I'm working on, also in the context of all of this, so for years in writing Incarceration Nations, everyone would ask me, "Are you filming?" Which used to annoy the hell out of me, because as a writer, I would say, I'm writing a book. Not everything has to be on camera. I know we live in the Instagram era. I know everybody watches TV and YouTube and et cetera, but can I not write a book? I love books. And especially my actor friend, he was always on my case, and I would scream at him and he would still be on my case. At a certain point, it became clear that there is a whole audience to be reached in the visual space. And so I've embarked now, and I do love multimedia work. I've worked in documentaries, I've worked in radio, and so I've now embarked on what I'm calling INN TV, Incarceration Nations Network TV. And there'll be a couple components of it. One piece of it is a series of short 6-minute documentaries that connect the dots in terms of this crisis around the world. And so the first one is up. It's on my website. The website is incarcerationnationsnetwork.com, and it's about pretrial detention. I've done screening events with it in Johannesburg, in Philadelphia, in New York, various other places. But there's going to be a whole series of them. So whether it's women, juvenile detention, pretrial detention, reentry, race, and incarceration, you're going to be able to get, in 6 minutes, a sense of how this exists globally. The other piece of the puzzle is a docuseries based on the book, which will take this into, hopefully, every living room, living rooms of people who don't read books, that is. Alas, what can we do? And I'm working with a director named Christy Jacobson, whose film I recommend everyone see. She just won the Emmy this month, actually. It's called Solitary, and it's about solitary confinement in a supermax prison in Virginia, an incredibly powerful film. We met, and I felt when I met her that I trusted her enough with this vision and with the issue to be able to work with her and start bringing the cameras in and start filming. And so in every country I go to now, I film at least one interview with someone who's experienced incarceration there, in the hope of trying to bring this issue out to light and bring people around it. So I will leave you with that. I will leave you with, once again, the 3 Ps and how they have shaped. I know that they've shaped my life, and I encourage you to be open to the universe, to allowing them to shape yours so that you can make an impact. I encourage you to think radically with your imagination around justice. I encourage you, especially in this space where we're at in America today, there's a lot of resistance, right? That's a word that we're throwing around a lot. Resist, resist, resist. And there's a lot to resist too. That's certainly the case. But I often think about a line from one of my favorite books. It's Angela Davis's Abolition Democracy. And in that book, Angela Davis says that she doesn't quite call it an error because she has so much respect for the abolitionist movement, which abolished, or in some respects abolished, slavery, or allowed it to morph into mass incarceration, rather, is more accurate. But she calls attention to the fact that the abolition movement's failure, and perhaps one reason why it was sort of permitted to morph into mass incarceration, its failure was that it was so busy destroying that it didn't build. It was about ending slavery instead of radically re-envisioning what comes next. And so my obsessive focus right now is, let's radically reimagine together what's possible. If we don't show people what is possible, what justice could look like, what justice should look like, and we only stay on the problem, then we're not going to advance past it. The future is in building, the future is in moving forward, in imagination, and in rethinking and re-envisioning whatever your particular role in this struggle is. I'll tell you that that film that you'll see on my website was actually made by, this is one other instance of someone who wanted to make a difference but had no background in mass incarceration or any of this. She read my book, she's a producer at CNN and she does graphics, and she said, if you ever need my help, let me know. 2 years later, I went back to her and said, since you asked, I need something made. And she did it for free. And that's her contribution. Without background, without knowing about this issue, this is something that we can all use our collective gifts to contribute to and be a part of. And so I leave you with that. Thank you for listening. Oh, I'm fine. I'm good. Are we doing?
Okay, we have 3 microphones. Anybody want to ask a question? Come on forward now. I'll get us started right now with a question from the students from NISA Poland.
Oh
Okay.
boy.
So they want to say, many prisoners in the book cooperate with different justice approach systems and forms and want to change and be a better person. What's the solution for those who won't stop being criminals?
So what's the solution for people who won't, quote, stop being criminals? Well, I think, for one, I often say this, that I have met many people who've committed crimes, but I haven't met that many criminals. Because a criminal is someone who is habitually committing the crime again and again and again, and cannot be stopped. My response is, there are people who, if they are in the world, will cause great harm and need to be kept away. But they need to be kept away in a facility that is so radically different from what prisons look like. Prisons are giving up. They represent giving up on someone. We need to never give up on anyone, period, end of story, and never lose faith in the capacity for change, even if that person dies trying.
Is it? Okay. My name is Matthew Pazin, and I'm from West High. And I wanted to ask, what made you choose this solution to the problem of mass incarceration, rather than trying to go to the core roots of like fixing the education so that people don't go towards mass incarceration, the problems of mass incarceration?
Great question. So that is part of the solution. For me, the idea is that there is no one answer, right? There's no one way to fix it. You've got to address what causes people to, right? Inequality, lack of access to education, lack of access to legal aid, and so on and so forth. You've got to kind of take it on all of the above. What I see this as is the collective effort to do all of those things. How do those look in different contexts around the world? So what you just mentioned is critical. Education is huge. And I am all about supporting initiatives in the community that are preventing people from going that route in the first place. It's sort of an all-the-above approach.
Okay.
Evelyn Jimenez from CCB. Given the bigotry that's so enhanced in America, do you really think the system could ever be overhauled to a more progressive replication of a better system?
I have to believe it, and I choose to believe it. And that's the simple answer, because absolutely, and it's not just in America, the criminalization of particular groups by, whether it's through race or class, I have seen that all over the world. And it is certainly designated. It's not accidental. Slavery is still legal in this country and punishment for a crime. We know all of this. There is a system that designed this around the oppression of particular groups. But you can't do the work unless you believe the work can be done. And so it becomes about how do you tackle this? How do you try? And how do you choose? I often say that a justice worker's job is to intentionally be optimistic. If you don't believe it can be undone, through raising consciousness, through awareness, through being vigilant as you watch systems morph from one system of oppression to another, then you can't do the work. So do I think it's an incredibly difficult task? Absolutely. Is there a legacy of ingrained racism, classism, all kinds of structures in place to keep this in the status quo? Capitalism, the big C, which I think is the mother of them all? Yes. But you have to choose to believe that something can change for the positive. Otherwise, you can't get up in the morning and do the work.
Hello? Hello? Oh.
Hi.
Do you believe that prisoners deserve life sentences for murder?
Licenses? What kind of
Life sentences.
Oh, life sentences.
Yeah.
Well, I don't. I'm going to be my radical self. I don't believe in prisons. You read my book, so you know this. I don't believe in prisons, so I don't believe in life sentences, right? I think that the thing about murder is that in the context of certain conditions, which we proliferate in this country and which proliferate in many other countries, including Brazil. Brazil, by the way, is about to overtake us on incarceration in terms of numbers. That's how bad it is. And the violence is equally so. Kingston, Jamaica, same thing. In the context of that level of dysfunctional conditions, it is actually, and the ready availability of guns and ammunition, it is perfectly conceivable that one ends up committing murder without intending to. Now, does that absolve that person? Of course not. Is that a heinous act? Of course. But the question is, and I think you all read my book, so you know I'm deeply invested in restorative justice practices, how do we address that in a way that is better than just locking somebody up and throwing away the key? I do believe in the capacity for people to change, and that means making better choices. It's also just important to note that murder, those who've committed murder have among the lowest recidivism rates in the system. So if it's a matter of public safety, that's not so much of an issue. That's a short answer to a very big question, but trying to...
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kim Mishkind, and I teach in the School of Business here. My question is one of asking for help from you. So many of the things that you talk about in the book in terms of improving conditions in prison and in terms of justice and in terms of making recidivism lower, educating prisoners.
I could hear you.
It makes so much sense to me. I need help understanding situations, some of these open prisons, the prisoner that's serving a 15-year sentence in Milan, going to school every day and then going to prison at night. That is a stretch for me in terms of thinking about just who he committed the crime. Help me understand how that results in a better long-term result for society and for the individual who committed the crime. How does it help in terms of justice and reparation against those who committed the crime? Is that?
Yes, no, I'm glad you asked that because to me, open prisons are the future. If there is to be such a thing as a prison that is so different from prison as to be worthy of another name. And the most inspiring models that I've seen involve a level of openness and a breaking down of the wall. I'm going to an open prison in Prague this week. I'm going to an open prison in Helsinki next week for women. The thing about, and actually the Prague one is very interesting because I found out about it because remember Warden Tom in Norway? He's my dear friend, my Facebook friend, and I noticed he was in Prague on his Facebook. And I said, what are you doing in Prague? He goes, they just modeled a prison after us. I said, well, connect me. I need to go there. So that's where I'm going on Thursday. But Tom, which is an amazing thing because finally prisons around the world are no longer copying the US, or not only copying the US, they're starting to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe we don't want mass shootings. Maybe we don't want that level of violence. Maybe there's something to this open prison concept. And so, number one, the thing about open prisons is that they create scenarios where people who are eventually going to come home maintain ties to the community, maintain ties to their family, are doing things in the world so that when they do come home, they are able to get jobs, be educated, and give back to the community. A lot of open prisons involve restorative justice practices where the people who've been harmed by these actions and the communities that are harmed by these actions get payback in some capacity, however that looks. And so it makes a whole lot more sense. And you're still in prison. You have to come home to that. In many respects, I mean, Ivan, who's in that photo, who's an extraordinary young man, is almost teased with freedom in the day and then has to go back at night. And that's pretty heavy. So it's not all, wine and roses in that respect. But I think we have to think about this collectively. What benefits all of us as a society? And it's only our sort of obsession with punishment that makes us do otherwise.
Is it all right if I just record
Sure.
it? I just want to know your answer for later. That's all. Let's see. I'm Riley Hunter from CSUB. So I know that you don't believe in prisons. You just said that earlier, and you were talking about your idea of what should be done in punishment. But I was going to ask, what is your take on the staggering discrimination that men face in the justice system, not just in the criminal justice system, but in all sorts of legal cases? Because we, like men, I don't want to say we, because I can't speak for all men, but we often face longer sentences, and a lot of the prisons, which you argue against, are also have very horrible conditions, and the guards tend to hold back while men fight and let gangs take over the prisons. So I was just asking your take on that.
So I think, I don't know, I think gender-wise, first of all, women are the fastest growing incarcerated population, globally speaking. And I think I tend to not, do a lot of comparing this worse off for me or it's worse off for you. I think it's just a matter of different. Now, there are lots of countries where you can really say prison is a man problem. And that doesn't mean that it's a country of awful men. It means it's a condition, it's creating a scenario around masculinity, where masculinity is tied to violence, where it's tied to gangs. South Africa is one of them, a country, that I call my second home. And it is very much an issue for men there too. That said, there are all these other countries, many of these Southeast Asian countries, where the women are especially vulnerable to the criminal justice system in ways that men are not, because of gender roles, because of being expected to do X, Y, and Z. And so, I'm horrified by violence in prison, out of prison, in any which way. I think we need an overhaul of who's doing the correcting and how they get trained. You read about the Norwegian Staff Training Academy. That's my model. But I try not to do too much of, it's worse off for this person or it's worse off for this person, and recognize every situation in its uniqueness.
My name is Lori Pasante, and the mic works, yay. Of particular importance to us here in Bakersfield is not just this issue, since we have many, many prisons here, but also because just east of downtown Bakersfield is the GEO Group-run ICE detention facility. They wish to expand their facility by 400 beds, is my understanding. So my question for you is, as a person who has had many, many conversations with many people around the world, how would you have the conversation about mass incarceration of people who are essentially being criminalized for human movement, especially when it's my understanding that immigration and trade are the top two concerns in polls amongst voters who tend to vote more conservatively? How do we engage in that conversation in a way that's civil and maintains civility? And how do we approach the problem of incarceration and immigration from a perspective of restorative justice principles?
So, God, well, for one, I would say we approach that conversation exactly as you just did it, tactfully, thoughtfully, pointing out the reality of this. But I think one of the most important things is for people to realize that even though we are, we have the end mass incarceration movement is massive, and some states are slowly starting to decarcerate, and we're talking differently about the opioid epidemic than we talked about crack, right? Because of obvious color differences between who's doing that. But despite all of those things and seeing maybe some progress, as we know, systems of oppression morph into new systems of oppression. And certainly ICE and detention and immigration is where a lot of the money is going now. And I think a lot of people talk about, private prisons, realize that in the state and federal system, a very small percentage of prisons are privatized. Immigration, on the other hand, is an area of massive economic growth. So I think one of the really important things that has to happen in terms of the conversation and people respond to dollars and cents and talk of corporate interests is that there needs to be a lot of focus on where the money is going with all of this. Now, on the larger question of borders, God, that's a crisis all over the world. And that's a larger conversation around what do we do with borders altogether? And how do we rethink them? In terms of the migrant crisis in Europe, huge percentages in many European prisons, I was in France and Italy, I'll be in Europe again, are foreign-born, and there is all of that crisis happening. But that's part of a much larger conversation around rethinking borders.
Hello, yes. I was wondering, how do you, I'm sure you have to frequently do so, how do you persuade critics who are vindictive or bloodthirsty towards the punitive aspect of prisons and feel that your methods are too soft or whatever, you know what I mean? So how do you persuade them that justice is adequately being dealt when they feel that prisons they need to serve as punishment, that the prisoners need to suffer for their crimes, etc.?
So, good question. I think one thing is that a lot of people throw the word justice around and they've never actually thought about what that means. So, are you talking about, I often ask people, are you talking about justice or are you talking about punishment? And punishment, as I write about, is really immoral, right, and illogical, because it says you did harm, so I'm going to teach you to do harm. I teach you to not do harm by doing harm to you. Restoration and reparations and all the other good rewords are quite otherwise, right? That to me is anyway. So I think the thing that I often point out, though, is that this is not just about mushy-gushy feelings and feel sorry for the criminals. This is about what creates safer communities. When I talk about INN, I talk about it as an organization that is about building safer communities for all of us. And when we think collectively and not I mean, I think America is as punitive as it is because it is capitalist. So capitalist, deeply capitalist. And capitalism is about the I. There are other systems that are more we-centered. And when we think we think you who committed that crime, right, and me who was impacted by that crime, we're kind of in this together. Let's figure out something that serves my needs and serves our greater needs. And so I just engage people around collective talk and a lot of talk about safety and community health.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jose Flores and I'm from here. My question lies between the death penalty. I know you're not for it, but it was...
What gave that away?
Well, so I recently watched a documentary called I Am a Killer, and that sparked an interest in me about, so my question would be is death row a meaningful life for prisoners who are incarcerated?
Is death row what?
Could they find it meaningful because some of them want to pursue death penalty because they don't want to live the rest of their lives in prisons, or And so I recently read an article about how they use religion to like find hope and like get their minds distracted from pursuing like imminent death. It's like, what would you think of that?
I think that the death penalty and life sentences are in many respects equivalent. I don't actually, in people's rhetoric around the death penalty, I'm quick to point out that having many people who are, I consider part of my family, who are serving life sentences, my students, it is cruel and unusual punishment and torture in a way that is akin to the death penalty. You are essentially burying someone alive when you give someone a life sentence with no possibility of ever coming home. So I really put those two things together in my head. I'm also shocked, appalled, and not remotely surprised that the death penalty came up in Trump's comments around the Pittsburgh murders, where he called for the return of the death penalty, which is something he loves to do. We can't forget he called for the Central Park Five return of the death penalty. And we need to remember that in study after study, we know it's not effective. Even if we were to accept that it's humane, it does not deter crime. Fact, period, end of story. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that shuts the whole conversation down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to reiterate what you started off with this evening: passion, purpose, and perseverance. Your words are very uplifting and encouraging to me personally. I teach on this campus, and I also teach at our local community college. And I also teach at Kern Valley Prison, a local prison here. And I also worked in a private prison teaching female inmates and female students. Part of that passion also came from being a victim of crime. My brother was incarcerated. My younger brother was also incarcerated in juvenile hall. He died in a drive-by. My sister was incarcerated. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be teaching on a college campus. And this issue is very, very dear to my heart. And the fact that we live in this valley, and every student in here, I'm sure someone knows someone that's incarcerated or that has died because of senseless violence. And we live in a valley where we're surrounded by prisons. This topic should really concern us. We really need to engage in a conversation about this. And I've actually started a coalition called PI, Previously Incarcerated and Educated. And
Love it. I'm taking that back to New York with me.
and
South Africa.
I need to speak with you because I want to join in this conversation locally, but the fact that you're doing this globally is amazing. And I definitely think we need to do something about this. And before I even knew of the word restorative justice, when I was working in the private prison and speaking with my students, my student aides, and talking about this issue, I thought, surely there's got to be something we can do. That we've got to make amends. People are hurting. There's definitely victims. There's the perpetrator. There are so many layers. And I remember in 2013 we had a forum here, and we talked about AB 109 and how that was going to change our community. And I remember talking to someone and saying, isn't there a way that we can bring families together? And somebody mentioned restorative justice, and I had never heard about it, and I thought, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. So thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for, at least for me, inspiring me and sparking or affirming what I'm doing. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that's incredibly powerful. Please see me after, because I want to give you a hug. But yeah, a round of applause. But I also think, listening to you, and I've had the privilege of being able to meet survivors of harm all over the world, and engage with them on a level and hear people say what you say, which is that, and I'm extrapolating here, so maybe I'm wrong, but that you can gather healing not by being punitive, but by being restorative. And that often, this is like a 101 for me, that being punitive is not going to get you the healing that you need. And I've heard remarkable stories like that from all over the world, which go ahead and reinforce that notion. And that's a story and a narrative that more people need to hear, because then all of their assumptions around punishment and revenge and harm become undone. So thank you for bringing that to us.
Okay, we'll finish up with the people that are in line, and then we'll get to the book section. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Destiny, and I'm a student here at CSUB. I understand that the prison to college pipeline is about more than just giving them a purpose while they're serving their sentence, as I understand this would help them when they get out of prison as well. Considering most of the governments around the world create barriers for what you're allowed to do with a felony, what are the most prominent career choices and education choices for the people that are going through these programs? Because I understand, if you have a violent crime with children, you're not going to be allowed to teach, and various issues like that. So what are they going into?
So again, passion, purpose, persistence. We encourage our students to go for what they want to go for. There are actually a lot more misconceptions about what people can't do having been to prison than there are restrictions. I have a student going to law school. There's a possibility he may not be admitted to the bar, but it's unlikely because we are going to advocate on his behalf. The restrictions around what you can't do, the discrimination is more de facto discrimination than it is legal barriers to becoming this, that, or the other. A scenario like that one involving a crime with small children and then being able to be an elementary school teacher, I think we can all see the logic in that. But the whole purpose of us, the team at Prison to College Pipeline being there, is to advocate for people doing whatever they want to do and living the life they want to live. We can give that a round of applause.
Hello, Doctor. Sorry. Hello, Doctor. My name is Chad Manning, and I was wondering, while I don't entirely believe in solitary confinement, there does seem to be some people out there who've committed some really heinous crimes. So my question to you is, do you really believe that everyone out there is redeemable, or are there really some people out there who just are too far out that even we can't save, people that care about?
There are irredeemable people. There are people who are so badly damaged that, they're not going to respond. There is such a thing as being irreparably psychologically damaged for whatever reason that is. And that's how I see that. My conception of those individuals who've done those supremely heinous things relates to psychological damage. But I think the key is that as human beings who believe in possibilities, I believe that it's incumbent upon us to keep trying. I also think that the greatest justice for someone who has committed that level of heinous crime is to be aware and to attain a consciousness of the heinousness of the harm that that person has caused. That's what justice looks like.
I'm gonna go over here. Hello? Okay. Hi, my name is Diana. I'm a student here at CSUB. My question is, or I'm just a little bit curious as to how these prison to college programs get started, or how are they actually funded? Because I don't think it's necessarily fair that I'm having to pay for a higher education, but then I'm also gonna have to pay for someone else to get a higher education as well. So I was just wondering if you can explain how that program starts.
So I can tell you about, the funding structure and such varies from country to country, and I hear a lot of that, especially in South Africa, where there's not enough colleges for people. So, why should the person in prison? And again, I respond to that by saying, we're in this together. And if we want to live in a safe, productive, healthy community, then we need to recognize that some people need a little extra support. And sometimes that support comes in the form of taxpayer dollars. We already operate that way, right? As a society, that's how insurances operate. It's how school systems often operate. People pay taxes, some pay more than others because they have a little more. So I think it's again about not thinking in terms of me versus you, but rather how do we collectively benefit when those who have historically been deprived and who, if not given this opportunity, may continue to live in that context, how will it benefit all of us? And so I just encourage people to think we over and above I. And I also, it's not an either or. Eligibility for financial aid. Our students do receive, many of them receive federal financial aid as part of an Obama experimental program.
Okay, thank you.
Something you said made me realize how much federal money is going to private corporations, including private prisons, and how that may increase the inequities we have in our society by federal money going to private corporations. And I wondered about the immigration, the way we detain immigrants is probably, a lot of it is being done by private corporations. And I think conservatives should consider how much money, may be interested in saving money in terms of the way we detain people. So I wondered if this federal government were to set up more informal camps that cost far less money, probably operated by the National Guard or something like that. Would you be in favor of that, or what's your take on spending less money by private corporations and transferring some of these operations to be operated by the federal government?
Well, I think before that, I would advocate just for massive overhaul of our immigration policy, of our draconian immigration policy, so we're not detaining people. I mean, this is a very, very big question, but overall, I think the key to remember is that some of the biggest moneymakers are, number one, immigration, number two, court fees and other fees and fines, which is another huge moneymaker in the criminal justice system that has nothing to do with private companies, surveillance devices, ankle bracelets, and things like that. That is a privatized industry and a growing one as we become an over-policed and over-surveilled society. And the bail industry, well, not in California and not in New York, although it's still a work in progress. But so there's money making all around. We can't quite only point to the private prisons, but I also think we need to radically rethink how we're doing immigration in this country.
Assuming that the current administration is intent on detaining immigrants, unfortunately, I can't.
We can chat after.
Unfortunately, I can't. With this man, I can't continue my question.
We can chat after, my friend.
We'll chat afterwards. Thank you.
Testing. Oh, sorry. Hi, Dr. Bass. I'm Stephen Carlos. I'm a CSUB student. I know you briefly touched up on the Philippines earlier in your lecture, and I'd like to know your views on the prison system there, especially the justice system. That's true. And actually, could you compare it to any of the other nations that you visited?
I'm very invested in what's happening in the Philippines for a lot of reasons. I mean, I love the Philippines. I had been there before, independent of prisons, and have many friends there, and just have watched that because I think it's very similar to these other countries, the war on drugs, whether it's in Thailand, whether it's Taiwan. It's just all of that on this magnified scale and extremely violent scale. And if any of you have not seen been following this, I highly recommend you look at the photo essay that ran in the New York Times maybe like 8 months ago, where you saw what it was like to walk down the street and there are literally body bags, because if you are doing drugs, the police can just kill you. And I was part of an event in the Philippines. It's a very long story, Incarceration Nations Part 2, where I met the head of that campaign and met a number of other government officials who were not shy in saying, we will take you out if you are using drugs. And drugs can mean a beer, frankly, there. So I think it's a really dire situation that's identical, actually, to what's happening in many other places where the war on drugs is at that level. It's just on a level of violence and with an unhinged dictator as a leader. Duterte, yeah. I'll pause, but
Yeah.
Duterte is a piece of work.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm a student at Bakersfield College. My name is Andy Sanchez. So you mentioned in your book about solitary confinement, and we all know you're not for the whole prison system. So I was just wondering, what would you change about it if the whole solitary confinement couldn't be taken out of the prison system?
What would I change about solitary confinement?
Yeah. What would you change for them to be ready to come back into society, or if they could?
Well, solitary confinement represents the opposite extreme of what I see as any way forward or the step toward progress, which is what I was talking about earlier, this idea of opening up the system. And instead of, locking people up for 24 hours a day, creating avenues and contexts where people can come out, go back inside, come out, go back inside. And I think, there is no good done to any of us when people who are traumatized and harmed become further traumatized and harmed in the context of solitary confinement, in the context of violent prisons, in the context of everything dysfunctional that happens behind prison walls. And so again, I say, let's think collectively about the we here and what benefits all of us and what creates safer communities. I mean, it's, again, there's a lot of these no-brainers and cliches, but they're all true. Hurt people. So harm, which ultimately damages us all. And solitary confinement, to me, is sort of the most extreme example of that because of how much harm it causes.
Okay.
Hello? So I've been sitting there for a while listening to everything and how everything's been proceeding, but I've just been trying to think of a question that I could possibly ask, and just one kept on coming to my mind. Then I had to make sure to actually write it down. So, to the families that may have had somebody murdered in their family, especially in this society, or in the very least, the culture that I myself was raised in, how do we have that talk that this restorative justice is a better alternative than to have the kind of punishment that we have today?
That's a great question, one to end with. I actually think my pie sister here in the front can answer it better than I can as a person who has the lived experience of that. So I think we should all connect. But I think I'll tell you a story. It's in the book, but I'll tell it to you anyway because this is a student of mine who's very near and dear to me, and he's the one who's been denied parole multiple times. He went to prison at 17. He grew up in the crack era in the South Bronx, and has served now 26 and a half years, and has been denied by the parole board. Was just 2 months ago denied for the 4th time. And this is a human being who's the most, not only would I bet my life on the fact that he's not going to come home and commit another crime ever, but I know that the world will be a million times a better place with him in it. He is just a gem of a human being, and someone who wants to devote his life to giving back, to doing work in the community, to everything good and everything positive that benefits us all. And at the parole board, the 2 parole boards ago, and they just won't let him out because the nature of the parole board is that way. What they said to him is, the victim wants more time from you. And I think of that story all the time because I think about that victim. And it's the mother of the boy who lost his life tragically in the context of another boy's tragic life. And I think, what are you going to get in another couple years of incarceration that you haven't gotten in 24 years? At what point do we say, you know what, maybe this is not going to give me the healing that I need and that I deserve, right? And that to me is a perfect example of something to share around this. It's about, how do we think about what your needs are? What would be justice to you? Every time I have the privilege of having a profound conversation and hearing from people who've survived harm, and I ask them the same question, and it's, what does justice look like for you? What does that mean for you? And I almost never hear prison. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.